I'm Dave Boyle. I have been asked, as Dot said, to do a bit of work on the community rights agenda and how it could be useful within community-led housing in all of its many potential implementations, and not getting into the ideological debate between co-housing, co-operatives, community land trusts and all of that stuff. That's between you all. So the my background in this is that my main job is to help community groups raise money to buy assets. Quite a few pubs, quite a few piers, Lidos, and many other things. And one of the tools which has been useful to groups I've worked with in the past has been one of these rights, in particular the community right to bid, which was part of the 2012 Localism Act, which brought in 4 community rights, which augment 2 existing community rights. So I'm going to briefly go through each of these 6 rights, explain what they are, how one would operationalise them, and then say a little bit about a kind of reflection on how useful or otherwise it may be within the housing, community-led housing sector. The sort of thing, I'm just going to stand up because I tend to move around a lot and be peripatetic, so it's much less fidgety. So the basic sort of big idea behind all of these is that, apart from one, which is this one, is that councils are the problem. The public sector is the problem, and whilst there is a legitimate New Left perspective that the state in all its forms has sort of become a barrier to communities achieving what they wish to do, it's fair to say the agenda is more of a right of centre agenda, that the state is a problem, and if there could only be less of it, it will be dead good and life would get better. Oh, really? But in governments of both parties have seen fit to advance this agenda. It's mostly been rhetorical, and actual implementable policy has been much more limited. So the 2 which were in use already were use and reclaim, and I'll come on to those, but these 4 were introduced in the 2012 Localism Act. So, sorry, no.
Can I read this out of this?
Okay, sorry, not build. Build wasn't part of that. So, first thing, to disappoint you all, one of the big things I've not looked at is the community right to build, because there's already lots of information within the CLT itself, there's stuff on the website, and so I've kind of left that alone. Now, I'm hoping that both Dot and Andrea and anybody else, if there is sort of a real desire to focus the discussion in the community right to build, that they can join in the conversation and help pick up the expertise on that side of things. So moving swiftly on, so apologies for that if that was the one which was really whetting your appetite, but we can come back to it in discussion. Community right to plan is the idea that the planning framework is set at a local authority level, informed by national planning policy guidelines set by the government. And the council, once it sets its planning framework, uses that framework to judge whether an application for development should go ahead or not. It's often a surprise to people that the fact that people don't necessarily want it is no good reason to stop something happening. Usually when a supermarket starts to open, 2,000 people sign a petition to their local councillors, and the councillors say we don't want it, but unless there is a material ground on which to hang your objection, there is no power to simply say we just don't really want that kind of thing round here. Is not a valid argument. So the community right to plan enables self-defined neighbourhood areas to create their own planning framework which exists alongside the council's planning framework. So for example, the council might have a view that any brownfield land should automatically, there should be a predisposition to allowing development of brownfield land for retail units, sheds and 0 hours contract jobs, that kind of stuff. And a community group might say that's a really crappy position to take across the city as a whole, and in this particular area it would be catastrophic and ruinous. So we define our area and then we create our own neighbourhood plan, And this plan means that any application for development which takes place inside that area, the community set policy framework is of equal validity to the council's framework. Which in theory sounds great, but the actual process to do something like this is challenging. So you first of all need to define your area. It doesn't need to be a ward level, it can be sub-ward level, it can cross ward boundaries. And then once you've defined your area, you have to get registered for as a neighbourhood forum. And this requires you to go through the process of having a referendum of everybody who lives in that particular area. So you define your area, and then everybody in that area is asked, do you want to create a neighbourhood forum for this area? And a neighbourhood forum has statutory sort of inheritance. It's not just a talking shop, it has specific legal powers. And once, if your local residents in the area vote to allow the forum to be created, that forum then has the right to create a neighbourhood plan, and they get on with it. And when they've created their plan, they submit it to the council, and the council then look at it and go, we need to do some resolution here. You're saying this and we say this, so how are we going to resolve it? So there's a process of negotiation between the two plans. There are 3 areas in Brighton which have created neighbourhood fora, and they're mostly all around Hove Station. And there's another one being proposed in Woodingdean, I think, and none of them have actually got to the stage of creating a neighbourhood plan, because that's, you can't, it has, because it joins a planning framework which is governed by quite a lot of legislation and secondary legislation. You can't just sort of say, we don't want X in this area and we'd like more of Y, and that'll be us. It's got to sort of follow the same sort of format, because it's got to have it's got to be able to be used alongside documents which have been created with that same sort of inspiration. In terms of how you might use it for housing, I think the challenge is that most community-led housing is relatively small scale. You're looking at even a relatively big development would only end up housing a couple of hundred people at the end of the process, whereas neighbourhood fora should be governing thousands of people. So the circumstances where you would think, although we only want to house a couple of hundred people at best, we need to activate thousands of people first in order to create some frameworks which enable us to take this right forward. I'm struggling to see how you would want to do it that way. I think once you've created some community-led housing and you've started to sort of, to use that horrible phrase, change the conversation in a particular area. Shoot me now if I ever say something as horribly bullshitty as that. But anyway, if you've started to change how people think about space and how they think about development and how they think about planning policy, then you might say, well, how can we do something more with this? How can we kick on to the next stage? But the idea that a group of people would look at the council's planning framework and go, oh, bugger, how are we going to get around this? And I know, well, let's create a neighbourhood forum. Whilst that's still a route to change the council's planning policy, you still have to get thousands of people to agree with you. And if the only reason you're doing it is to provide a house for you and 7 other people in your housing co-op, then it's kind of really, you've just got to find somewhere else where there's more land or more opportunities. So whilst it's a powerful tool, it feels like the kind of thing perhaps the Community Land Trust might be more the appropriate body which might identify an area and use its resources to do something. Andrea, do you?
I just wanted to ask, when you said all the people in the area have to vote,
yes.
What's the figures? So how many what if most people don't reply or anything? What's the threshold?
I've not been able to find that out.
Okay.
So my instinct is that there's not many neighbourhood fora. So one argument will be that's because the threshold's quite high. The other argument is it's so tedious that nobody would ever bother. So is it falling at the first hurdle or at the second? My instinct is the first. It would be ridiculous to have a policy at local government level which you had turnout criteria when put it another way, you couldn't realistically have a policy which said you need to have a level of turnout to create a neighbourhood forum which is likely to be 2 times greater than that to elect the councillors whose policy you're trying to overturn. It doesn't stop them with trade union ballots, but in general, I can't imagine that there would be anything other than a base level threshold, something like 10% of the area.
Yeah.
Once you've got that.
I think it's higher to pass the actual plan.
Yeah.
To get to that stage, I think it was something like 50%.
That's the plan, but to create the forum is
my
lower.
understanding of the forum is that you only need 21 members to actually form the forum.
But to actually get to the stage where it actually is
I've never
created.
seen anything about having to vote for the forming the forum.
Yeah, I think it's just the plan.
It's just the plan itself at
That's not okay. Well, I stand corrected.
Well,
no, I was going off the
So I'm gonna
DCLG website.
Right,
so,
okay.
but I can go back and check that.
Yeah, I thought the referendum came later on
Right.
to implement the plan.
Right.
And then there's the threshold of having a certain percentage of the population to rectify.
That would make more
ratify.
sense.
Okay, thank you.
So let's move on to community right to use. This is a general right which is not embodied in legislation or policy, which essentially says it's used to be called something called the asset transfer regulations. Councils have the ability to sell land or indeed give land or assign leases for property they control at less than market value up to £2 million. Which means that if you have a piece of council land and they are doing nothing with it and you think you could do something more useful with it, you can start to have a conversation with them where the fact that they might say, we've had this valued and if it was development land it would be X amount of money and that's therefore the market value, so there's nothing you can do, that's the price. You can talk to them about using their powers under the asset transfer regulations to give it to you or indeed sell it to you at a less than market price, and that's a general right which exists. It's not a right you have as citizens to demand they sell it or to demand that they treat your offer with any seriousness. It's a right the council has to not achieve best value for its assets. So
was that asset transfer
regulations? Yeah. So various amendments to the Local Government Act which generally say, for good long-standing reasons, because the easiest way to do corruption in local authorities is to undersell assets to your friends. And then they, basically this is how Britain ended up looking so shit after the Second World War, because council land was given away to crony developers who then built shoddy buildings with terrible designs. And those, so in order to stop that, you had to at least get the land assets into the private sector for development at full market value. And then this then becomes a vehicle to turn away any community-led activity where the pathway to getting your finances is likely to not be full market value. You're not going to be able to make those prices in any meaningful time frame. So there's a general right that the council, if a council ever says to you, this land, we have to get it at best market value. We've had an offer from Peel Developments for £2 million for it. What can we do? We'd love to give it to you, fluffy community people, for £1 million, but we can't. You can say to them, oh no, you can. You have the ability to do this. If they go, no, we're not prepared to deal with you. We don't wish to give you this asset. We don't wish to sell it to you. You do have the right to an appeal, essentially. It's called the right to reclaim land, which enables you to appeal to the Secretary of State to say, our council is sitting on a lovely bit of land which we've made a perfectly decent offer for, and they have said no. And the Secretary of State can order them to change their policy on it. Not many people have used it because in the main, I think in the context of current local government finances, if you have a piece of land that is really surplus to their requirements and you have a reasonable offer for that land, most councils will be very happy to talk about getting rid of unused parts of their land. They desperately need the money. So if you're making a reasonable offer for the land and they're saying no, then it's probably because they've got a good reason. It might be a good reason which you don't like they're holding on to this land because it enables them to be part of a bigger development and it's some kind of ransom strip, and that's why they don't want to lose it, and that's exactly why you want them to lose it, because it enables the whole development to go ahead. and therefore if you got that bit of land it would collapse the entire development. That's might be a very good reason, but you're down to really, will the Secretary of State think that it's a good reason or not? And they've got you've got no ability to appeal it beyond pure judicial review kind of process. They didn't follow the legal process and respond to me in time. The actual decision of the Secretary of State is whatever the Secretary of State feels like. So it comes down to who is the Secretary of State, what floats their boat, who can lobby them hardest. Councils tend to have more ways into the department or the ministry than citizens do in general. So it's unclear as to how much of a right it really gives you. Again, if the council are digging their heels in to the extent that you are essentially appealing their intransigence to the Secretary of State, unless there is some good political capital to be had by the Secretary of State giving the local council a kicking, which generally means you need a Tory Secretary of State and a Labour council who've been going, fuck you, and they'd like to give them a kicking on this. And there's an issue about whether you want to be part of that look, really. Do you want to be the boot which they kick the council with? Or alternatively, there tends to be a political dimension that the council are really beyond the pale. So it's not, I really don't see how it's going to get used very much, and I don't really see it of much use in the housing sector, to be perfectly honest, because if there is a good reason, if there is a good piece of land and a good deal to be done, then for all of its many manifold faults, the current financial climate means that they are at least more open than they have ever been to reasonable offers for land which is generally surplus to requirements. Community right to challenge is a fascinating one. Most of these rights in the Localism Act came about through the coalition government, and so they spliced together two political philosophies. The community right to bid is the Liberal Democrat part of that philosophy. The community right to challenge is the Conservative part of that philosophy. It basically says any citizen can challenge the council's delivery of services and say, we could do that better. So you don't like your bin collection, you can challenge the council to say, we could run our bins better, which in general is a slightly ludicrous way to deal with public service reform, but it's also unlikely that anybody would ever be able to get their arse in gear to create their own bin collecting service relatively quickly. But what happens is you write to the council and say, we think X service could be and should be better delivered by somebody else other than the council. Essentially it's a right to ask for it to be privatised. And then the council go, they don't, if there might just be a potential positiveness to it if they then said, okay, go on then, you've got 12 months to talk to the staff, talk to the trade unions, talk to people who know what they're doing and actually come up with a better bid. But no, what then happens is that it gets forcibly outsourced and anybody can bid for the new service. So you might not like the bin collection service in your particular area, and you might think it's an absolute disgrace, and you might think that a community-led cooperative would be a much better way to do this, but Veolia would come in and basically tell you to piss off and outbid you and win the contract for the council because it's on best value basis. I've struggled to find a single instance where anybody's even asked to challenge since the legislation came in, still less actually get a challenge over the line. But it was a clearly kind of, there were Conservatives who were going, why are we giving the community rights to challenge developers through this right to bid? That's not what Conservative governments do. Conservative governments enable privatisation, and so they instituted this challenge, and that was part of getting the legislation over the line, was that there needed to be some red meat given to both of the parties who needed to get it over the line. So then we move on, the other reason why, apart from its hideous ideological provenance, the other reason why the right to challenge doesn't really have much to say to housing is that it solely is dealing with services. So if you're trying to get access to land, it's not really very useful. If you're trying to get access to better planning decisions, technically you could ask them to outsource the planning function of the council to get people in who were not crap at dealing with community housing, but the chances are that you would be outbid, and it doesn't really advance your agenda at all.
So the right to challenge is only on services?
Yes, only services.
So I'd assume therefore that council-led schemes that are developing housing would not fall under this, even though housing is perhaps seen as a service of some sort?
I was trying to get to the bottom of whether housing would be seen as a service, but it would be the service as a whole. It would be a borough, it would be a city-wide thing. You couldn't peel off.
Just pick off
You
one
couldn't pick
development.
off developments. No. Yeah. It's the provision of a statutory service by the council as a whole. So unless the council devolved its services into lots of little sort of service units, which were independent of each other and all had their own directorates, then you might, but it would require massive and completely pointless local government reorganisation.
So you could try and take over the whole of running council housing. That's your challenge.
Yeah, but again, if you're a community land trust, you could maybe think about it. But not for the But if you ever did go down it, there's before they even get to the stage of putting it to a public tender, you have to demonstrate that you've got some capacity, you've got the expertise, you've got the capital, you've got the experience, and at that point, so there are plenty of reasons why a council could refuse it. And again, like if the council is thinking, actually, it's not a bad idea to get rid of the legal services team, they've probably already done it. The idea that they could be given like a wake-up call through this community right to challenge is frankly specious. It's unlikely to happen. The one where all the action is, really, and I think of most interest, but again, within limits, is the community right to bid. Often called the community right to buy, but since we're not in Scotland, there is no such right. If you're in Scotland, you have a genuine right to buy, but again, this is England and we do things differently here, much to my annoyance. So the community right to bid enables community groups, interested individuals, some public sector bodies to designate certain land or buildings as assets of community value. Talk about what that means and how you get it in a moment, but once an asset has been designated of community value, for the next 5 years, should anybody wish to sell that building or land or assign a lease for more than 25 years on it, the community are given the right to suspend the sale or assignment for 6 months in order to prepare a counter offer. Because it's not a right to buy and just a right to bid, you have the right to prepare a bid, you have the right to try and raise funds, and the property owner has the right to tell you to fuck off at the end of this tortuous process. The property owner has the right to cut off their nose to spite their face and take an offer which is lower than your offer, because there's nothing which compels them to accept any bid whatsoever. Again, if in Scotland, it will be a very different situation. So, an asset of community value can be any piece of land or property. Unlike most of these which deal with the public sector, this applies to any piece of land or building across the country, across England, apart from certain designated statutory buildings, like where essentially the building is used for the delivery of a statutory service, like a fire station or something where there's a part of the emergency services. So those kind of assets are off limits. But unless there's a schedule at the back of the legislation which details those services whose assets are not able to be nominated as of community value. But beyond that, there is nothing to stop you designating this building, the train station, the level, London Road Market. It's all fair game. The council are the people who determine whether something is or is not an asset of community value. There is no right of appeal for a decision from a community group. There is a right of appeal for the property owner. So you nominate the asset. The council decide, do they think it's an asset of community value? They can, if they say it is an asset of community value, the property owner gets to say, hang on a cotton picking minute, I want to take this to an appeal. If they say it is not an asset of community value, you have no appeal to challenge that decision. For an asset to be of community value, there needs to be several things which have been done. Firstly, you need to be a valid group. So this could be a valid group is a charity, which has got legal charitable status, a community interest company, a community benefit society, and the critical thing is that the organisation needs to have an interest in the local area. So you shouldn't get an organisation registered in Newcastle nominating things in Brighton, for example. But because lots of groups don't yet have legal personality, there is also the possibility that a local group which is unincorporated, which has 21 local citizens signed up to it, those citizens need to be on the electoral roll for local government purposes, which means EU citizens are currently for the next 6 months potentially able to sign those things. And also they don't need to be necessarily on the local authority electoral roll for the area in which the building is. It could be a neighbouring authority. So in Brighton, pretty much you're looking at Brighton, Mid Sussex, Lewis and Ada are the neighbouring authorities which people can be registered. These 21 people need to have joined a group which has a constitution which says we care about the local area. That's all it needs to say. It needs to be you just need to have a governing constitution, which is, can be a page. This is the group, it has members, we elect people, the end. There's very little required from the group. It is essentially the kind of thing which you could create a local group in a pub in an evening by getting enough people to sign it. So if you've got the right group or you've got the right status, that's check one. Check two is, has the building or land been used for community value in the recent past? And there are several parts to this which one needs to unpick. It needs to be non-ancillary use, which means it needs to be direct. So I'll give you an example. There was a recent case where somebody was trying to say that a school playing field was an asset of community value because people walk their dogs on it and people play football on it, sort of climbed over the fence and used it, and it was clearly used for the community's benefit. But because it was a school playing field, the main job of that piece of land was to be a playing field for a school. And because the nomination was saying it's all about dog walkers and people playing football and jumpers for goalposts, having a kick around of a weekend, that benefit was an ancillary use of the asset. It wasn't its main purpose. So it has to be a community benefit, needs to be something which is provided by being what it is, as opposed to a side effect which was a happy kind of coincidence. So that's one thing which does shave off quite a lot of potential assets. So for example, if in reality an office building, there might be a thriving community of people who use an office building to the extent that if you took this office building out of their lives, there would be a community which would collapse and a whole support network would collapse. But the people who run the office do not run the office in order to create a community, they run it to make money. And therefore the fact that there is a community benefit from its presence is not a direct attribution of community benefit. Also, the recent past is interesting. There is no legal definition for recent past. I've seen a council in London say that the recent past is the last 6 months. And I've seen a council say the recent past is the last 50 years. And both are correct because the law gives the council absolute jurisdiction to define what it means by recent past. In Brighton, it seems that they're thinking 5 years is on the edge, 10 years is totally out. The only test case we had was the Hippodrome, which stopped being used in about 2006, and they rejected an asset of community value nomination on the grounds that it had been out of use. It had not been used for anything in the recent past. Other councils have taken a view that a building which stopped being used for community use in 1962, because it had been in use since about 1800, it had still spent most of the last 200 years in community use, and they thought that was reasonably fair. Most councils have not been so ecumenical in their interpretation of the legislation, and the council could be an ass, but they have legal right to do so. And there's no reason why they have to be, unless they put a policy in place, which Brighton and Hove has not. There's no reason why the fact that they said 10 years was too much last week is what they need to say this week or next week. There's no requirement for consistency and no right to challenge them on that. So let's say you are still within that grounds though of community usage, and you meet that test. The other part of the test is that the building has to be capable, or land has to be capable of providing community benefit at some point in the next 5 years. Lots of councils think, oh well, in the future it's 5 years, so recent past, I suppose that could be 5 years too. There's no legal requirement that they do, but it seems to be a big part of how they think of it. Luckily, you don't, in order to prove that the community's usage in the next 5 years is possible, you don't need to have gone the whole hog of providing a business plan, business case, how you'd raise the finance to buy it, etc., etc. It needs to be merely not fanciful. That was a test case, which I'm going to blow my own trumpet, we won for the Rose Hill Tavern, where they said that our plans to turn it into a community-run pub were fanciful because we didn't have a business plan which showed how we would keep it open after the first 6 months, and the judge, God bless him, Peter Lane, said this is no impediment whatsoever, and they merely needs to demonstrate that there's no reason why, if other things changed, it couldn't be used for the community. So the main reason why that will be prohibited is planning permission. So that with the Rose Hill Tavern, they said if the planning permission had been granted by Brighton Council to turn it into residences, then it would be fanciful that it could ever become for community benefit again, because you're not going to basically buy 2 houses, turn them back into a pub. Whereas if it's not yet got legal permission to become 2 residences, then all bets are off, and therefore it could become a pub once more, even though it had closed. The planning permission situation is the main reason why a council would refuse to give you asset of community value nomination status about the future, because they'd say the pathway to it being to becoming reused by the community is so ludicrous as to be fanciful, because once it's got planning permission, you can start work when you've got your bill of, when you've got your certificate, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. So, it would need a change of heart by the current owner, complete finance to be provided to demolish it or to completely re-renovate it, and these are too many hurdles, and that would fail the next 5 years test. If you get your building or land nominated as an asset of community value, a couple of things happen, some of which can be positive. So you've got this 5-year period when, if the owner wishes to sell it, they have to notify the council. Now, they don't have to notify the council. It's just that no sale of a building or land can be registered by the land registry on an asset of community value without a letter from the council accompanying the transfer documents, which say that the requirements of the Localism Act have been complied with. So if you've not written to the council to say, we wish to sell this asset of community value, then the council can't write that letter, and therefore you can't transfer the asset legally by registering it at the land registry. So some councils are less forgiving of landowners who try and do a sneaky sale than others, and Brighton has had a checkered past on this one. But technically, if you wish to sell it, you notify the council and you say, I wish to sell this asset here. And the council then write to you who've nominated this asset and say, do you want to make a bid for it? At that point, from the moment the council gets the letter, you've got 6 weeks to decide whether you're going to make a bid or not. You don't have to make a bid. Another group who has the right status could come in and make a bid for you, which begs the question, could somebody like the Community Land Trust potentially be the body who's nominated all these pieces of land as assets of community value, and if the asset becomes available for a bid, then it contacts people who then sort out becoming the bidders for it. So there's the nominating process and the bidding process. The law kind of assumes that there will be the same people, but they don't need to be.
Does that mean it's a competitive bid then?
No, what happens is that essentially for 6 months, I mean, it's competitive in the sense of if you're trying to sell the land, you can keep it on florets, you can keep it on a property website and sell it, you just can't close it. And you can't process the land. What you could do is actually make an agreement to sell it, you know, in 6 months' time when these fucking community bastards have been driven off my land. I will sell it to you for this price, but we can't actually complete the purchase until 6 months have taken place. And it's completely legally possible to do all of that. So it's competitive in that sense. If you say, yes, we'd like to launch a bid, you then get another, it's not another 4.5 months. From the date, the critical date is the date the council are told, I'm selling the thing, and then you've got 6 weeks to decide are we going to bid or not. And then if you decide to bid, you've got 6 months from that date the council were told to before which it can't be sold and processed by the land registry. And that's your opportunity to get your shit together and raise your finance and come up with your plan and approach the landowner. It does beg the question, because this still needs the consent of the landowner to do the deal, are they likely to do a deal with somebody who's literally fucked their shit up with this? Or are they going to go, I would have got away with it if it wasn't for you pesky kids, and I wouldn't sell to you bastards if you were the last people on earth. Whereas if you are in that position where you have somebody who you think you could do a deal, then you could do a deal with them. So it tends to be used where you have somebody who's being a silly git, who is thinking that I can achieve X amount of value for my asset, and they just need a corrective sort of wake up and smell the coffee and deal with the reality. It tends to have been used predominantly for pubs. There are about 7,000 assets of community value, of which around 5,500 are pubs, of which 100 have actually been bought by this moratorium period. What tends to happen is that the story goes, somebody gets hold of a pub, they think, Christ, I could make so much fucking cash if I just closed it and turned it into 4 flats. And the local community go, that's our boozer. And the owner goes, it was your boozer, it's my retirement pension fund. And that's how it's going to be. So you use this process to essentially put a poison pill on it. Once you put an ACV on, to the bloodiest minded of developers, it's not a huge hurdle. It's a pain in the arse, but you know, if you eat babies for breakfast, as most developers do, it's not that much of a problem to get over this hurdle. But for the kind of developers who tend to be at the early stages of their development career, who are not big corporations but are somebody who started doing a few house renovations here and there and now they consider themselves a developer because they've done it 6 times, that kind of person tends to be scared off by an ACV. It tends to be a kind of, fucking hell, I'm not touching that with a barge pole, because it's an encumbrance on the building, especially if it's a pub. Because if it's a pub, it means you lose your permitted development rights and you can't just turn it into another shop or a bookies or usually an estate agent's tends to be the main alternative use of them. And it means that the council have to put it before the planning committee if there's a proposal to turn it into residences, when they do have, without an ACV, they've got massive discretion as to whether they can put it through or not. So if it's a pub, it is a bit of a poison pill. It does act as a block. An ACV, the other interesting thing about an ACV is that I mentioned about how if you go to a planning committee and say, we don't want X thing to happen, that's not enough. An ACV has the ability to be a material planning consideration, which means that a council can refuse to give planning permission and cite the fact that it has an ACV as the reason why it refuses planning permission. Obviously the reason why it's got an ACV is because nobody wants the fucking supermarket here. But since that's not a good reason, making it an ACV becomes the reason to stop the demolition of the building and its replacement with the supermarket, when otherwise it wouldn't be able to just say, we don't want it. problems and interesting things with the bid. I think it's most useful to housing groups as that kind of wake up and smell the coffees to somebody who's refusing to see a good deal at the end of their nose. You've got a good deal you could do with a developer or somebody who owns a piece of land, and they just don't want to talk to you. It's a bit like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. They have a vision of retiring to Ibiza, and if it wasn't for you pesky kids, they really would have got away with it, and they cling on to the money they could have had rather than the money which you are offering them right now. And eventually they will realise that that money has gone and it is never coming back, and they might as well take the very good deal which is in front of them right now. And where they cleave to this idea of the riches which they could have, the ACV can bring them back down to earth and sort of force them to realise that actually this is a good deal which you're offering me and I really should do it, especially if the local community are behind your bid. Because you need a community group or at least 21 local citizens, it tends to be the case that in pubs certainly you can offer the pub landlord or the pub owner a fork in the road. This way is bloody mindedness and complete hatred by everybody you know who lives around you, or this way you get quite a good bit of money and everyone thinks you're dead nice. And you can offer people that choice, and lots of people prefer the money and nice rather than pain and misery and hatred. So that tends to be a way in which you can force people back to the negotiating table, but there has to be the rudiments of a good deal. If your fundamental problem is you can't raise the money to actually buy the land at the rate they think is a good rate for it, then the ACV process probably won't change those fundamental economics and the misalignment of the vendor's expectations and your ability to pay.
Well, you say that, but you do get time to raise the money, don't you?
You do get time, yes, so, and that can be the other thing. It's if you've got somebody who's trying to get rid quick and you just need to put a block on it because you've got finance you can raise through debt and through some equity potentially, then and you need some time to do it, then that's a possibility. The critical thing is that in all my experience of working with groups who've tried to exercise the right to buy, the right to bid and make it something which ends up with a sale, is that the 6 month period goes like that. And what lots of groups do is they nominate the asset and then they go, phew, right, so let's park that for now, and then suddenly it gets reactivated at a moment of the owner's choosing, and then they have to get up to DEFCON 5 again really, really quickly, and it's usually too late. It's not quite enough time to make it happen. So if you've got the ACV in place, then you must keep the pressure on internally to do all of the work which you need to do to complete the deal, so that when the opportunity presents itself, you're able to go like that.
So do you have to apply for it before it goes up for sale, or say if something comes up for sale and you think, oh, we want to try and save that, can you then have the opportunity?
You can retrospectively do it, but the problem comes from it becomes about political willingness. So when you make an application for an ACV, the council technically have 56 days in which they have to let you know whether they are going to say yes or no. Brighton's record is 128 days. You could take out a judicial review to say you are not in keeping with the Localism Act 2012, but who's got the cash or time? They seem to be a little better at it, but even so, let's say the council are. If you had a building where there was some political support for it, where a councillor of senior rank could say to the people dealing with it, process this fucking quickly and do it in like 2 days, then yes, it could be really useful. If, however, it's one of those developments where you suspect that the council are quite supportive of the loss of the amenity and its conversion to residences because they've got residential targets and this person's offering to create 4 of them, then the easiest way to avoid dealing with it is just to sit on it for 7 weeks and then deal with it in the 8th week, by which point hopefully it'll have been sold. And so even if they subsequently they can still make it an ACV, so the new owner, who an owner sold it to a developer, and the developer now owns an asset with community value,
Yeah.
but the developer's not going to sell it. They're going to knock it down and get planning permission on it, and it's never going to be something which excites the legislation to give you the opportunity to rebid. It could still be useful, but it's not something, but it's if the building comes, if your first awareness that this building could be lost or this asset could be lost is the fact that it's up for sale, then you're already running to catch up, and you might not ever catch up. So, you know, the sort of, some places have gone through a parish council. There was a parish council in Essex, which basically thought in these challenging financial times, the county council would happily sell anything to anybody. So it basically made pretty much every post box, every phone box, every public loo, every school, pretty much every building in their village an asset of community value, and that was a kind of up yours to the county council. That kind of preemptive strike is quite useful, but it tends to annoy as much as persuade people to sort of deal with you and come to terms. So it feels like it's more politically showy to do that kind of thing. But a CLT, for example, if it wasn't being politically showy, but did just want to make a statement that these rights were available, and there's a bigger political point, I think, that involving people in the process by which things get done in their community is a good thing, and the ACV is a limited opportunity for people to become involved in what happens in their community, and therefore there should be more of them. There should be more opportunity to participate, and the CLT could be the people who make this happen. It's potential there. In terms of housing specifically, one of the explicit exclusions for ACVs are residences. So things which are already houses are not able to be made ACVs. Things which have houses in them, like pubs upstairs, can be made ACVs. But if it's just a residence, then it's just not possible to make it an ACV. So how would you use it? You'd find a building. So let's use the Dyke pub at the top of Dyke Road. 1900s build, pub on the ground floor, two flats on the middle floor, massive vaulted attic, which you could do something with. In that particular instance, the challenge was raising the money to buy it from them. Their expectation was about 1.5 million, which, if you're trying to just run a pub, that's quite a lot of money, and it's quite a lot to take on. Whereas if there was a community-led housing project in that particular part of town, they could go, hang on a minute, why don't we turn the top 2 floors into 6 units, and you have the pub downstairs, we'll have that bit up there, and we'll use the ACV process to force the pace.
How does that happen in actuality? So if it's pre them putting it on the market, is it just because a bunch of people that drink in there notice, or you notice it driving past?
It's almost serendipitous.
You've got to kind of look out and think, and then is it advised that you then engage the owners personally first, or do you go straight in on?
As a general rule, I think it looks better to have tried to engage the owners. One of the ways owners will, because a lot of these things with ACVs end up being fought partly in a battle for public opinion, and also a battle for raising the money to do the deal. And it's losing the PR war, which starts to force them back to the table to talk about real money and doing deals to take assets, or to sell you the assets. The other challenge you'd have is that since you would want to turn these assets into some residential capacity, a lot of these rights, the community right to bid has been, it's never been stated explicitly, but the main reason it is on the statute book is to stop pubs being turned into housing. So as a means, whilst there's no reason why you can't use it to turn pubs into housing, it's a non-standard implementation, and you'd need to find a pub or an asset like a pub in classic terms where the community didn't give a shit where they would be happy to work with you to turn it into something better than that crap hole. And it's so the circumstances by which you can have an active community campaign which can get the asset listed, but they can be willingly complicit in the loss of the asset to some fundamental degree to enable some housing to be part of the solution. It's challenging. It's not to say it's impossible. So there have been several instances where it's been used, like, again, because it's pubs are the main use for it. Pubs where there's a lot of land, and the people in the community just want the pub, but it comes with lots of land, and they've recognised that they need to do something with the land, and why not have a community-led housing solution to use the land. That's happened in a couple of places.
So, for example, all these epic spaces that we've got down in the centre of Brighton, where it's like just being left to ruin, and so many. Yeah. Are those the kind of things, or
the challenge will be if it's left to ruin, then it will fail on the recent past.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is determined as a community use? Like, what period does it need to be community use for it to qualify? And could you put a temporary use in there if it's vacant already? There's a temporary use for 6 months as a community centre.
You put a pop-up use in there, and that pop-up use, the more community value dimension it is. If you put in, I don't know, welfare rights advice is one of the things which gets run from that centre on a voluntary basis. Then using it, that's a really interesting use where you basically give yourself the opportunity to say that it's been reopened recently without actually having the keys to be able to reopen it. Is there a period
of time that needs to leave to qualify? Or?
No, if it's currently being used in meanwhile use, then it clearly meets the recent past because it's still going on. The council might take the view that the usage of, let's say you've got a big asset and you're only using one room in it, that the new usage is not commensurate with the whole of the site. The big problem with the whole legislation is that the government didn't want to think through all of this stuff and just kick the can to the councils to say, you work this shit out. And some councils have gone as far as to put policies in place about what they mean by recent past, what they mean by in the near future, and so that people have an idea, and that those decisions about how they interpret the legislation are subject to political change and negotiation and consultation. Brighton basically leave it to the legal officer of the day to decide what she thinks or he thinks, and they've been mostly okay with them, but that could change in an instant. And so there's, one of the things we were trying to do a few years back was to get the council to actually put in place a democratically agreed interpretation policy, so people knew where they stood about what exactly would count. So if you did use meanwhile space, would that sort of revivify the asset for the purposes of how the council would interpret it?
What about if it's being used illegally, so like for homeless people and stuff, if you could say this building is currently, if there was evidence, I mean, I'm just talking pie in the sky really, but then could it be housing with a community centre, medical centre?
It would be a fascinating test as to whether something which was technically illegal was also allowed legally to meet a definition for community. There's no reason why it can't be. It comes down to whether the council in Brighton would think, or would they go, it can't possibly be that if it's illegal, it therefore can't be community usage. That's nonsense, but it is an interpretation they would be able to make, and nobody could do anything about it.
Make a precedent either.
And what about churches? Is there any track record of churches being
There's been a few churches which have been used for this. The challenge with churches is that the appeals tribunals have basically said community value, community amenity. It's actually, the definition is community well-being. If it's a religious usage, it can't be for the community. It is for a proportion of the community. Now, if you think through this, a pub is only for those people who like pubs, but it's technically open to anybody who chooses to go in there. Whereas most religious, there will be various groups of people who will not be allowed to go into them. Again, a pub, there are people who are not allowed to go into pubs. They're called children, and but it's shot through with inconsistencies. But the tribunal rulings have basically said that a religious community, a benefit to a religious community is not enough of a community benefit. So if you were going to get a church, it would have to be a church which was used for non-denominational usages. So you'd have to have a church which was also a play group which anybody could go to in the daytime, as well as doing church services and the God stuff.
So could it include council offices and council buildings?
Yeah. The council, there's nothing which would stop the council offices being an ACV in principle. The issue would be what is the community benefit from them, and the fact that the council it tends to be about the usage of the building creates the community benefit rather than the community, the activities which take place create community benefit elsewhere.
Yeah.
So the issue would be, so something like a council leisure centre or a council run facility in which the community came together to do stuff in is far more likely to meet the criteria than the council run the adoption or the fostering service from this building, and that provides community benefit.
Do you live in Brighton?
Yeah.
So are you paying close attention, and like can you flag up because it almost feels like we should have like a working group, because who knows what and who knows, but for example a leisure centre facility or a bit of old university building or something potentially. But that's a job in itself, isn't it?
It is.
Keeping your eyes peeled.
There is a could the Community Land Trust, this is the arbitrage they're making. The first flipper of the asset makes an absolute killing, because you sell it as a pub and you turn it into properties. And and what they've started to do is a lot of the pubs have now started to sell them to stupid developers, because they're thinking, why should these fuckers get the upside? So Enterprise Inns, who are a big owner of many pubs, will sell them to stupid developers who are on their third or fourth sort of, hey, I'm a property developer, I've turned 2 flats into saleable properties, and they will sell them to them on the basis of, planning permission will be easy, fine. So we're selling it at development prices as if it had planning permission. Once you've found a pillock who's prepared to take that deal, you've created a problem that the price to get it back down to the reasonable level of cost is how much that pillock can eat £200,000. And most of them can't. Most of them can't afford to wear that kind of cost, so they plough on, which is why the pub owners are the sort of a massive guilty party here. But the equal guilty party is the credulous developer who's prepared to take a chance on planning permission being relatively easy to get. Because in one in 2 cases it is. In the Freshfield Inn, it's been easy to get 22 flats, £200,000 plus build costs, happy days.
There was a pub up at Woodingley, which was in similar price. When I saw it, I actually just thought it was a joke, but crazy price. Now. Sorry if you've said this already, but can you extend these? So once you've done the 6 months, can it be reapplied for?
No. Once you get the once you get the nomination, it stays on what's called, amazingly enough, the list of assets of community value. And it stays on that list for 5 years from the moment it's registered. If it goes through to if somebody goes to sell it, you go to buy it, you don't make it. If it's sold to somebody else after the 6 months, then it's automatically removed from the assets of community value register, but you can renominate it at that point. And if it's not sold, then it's under what's called the protected period, which means for the next 12 months after the 6 months have ended, nobody can stop a sale. So the owner is free to do what they want to do for the next 12 months. 18 months after they've tried to sell it, if they've not sold it, you can trigger another 6 months period where you can block out anybody else, and so on. And nobody's ever got to the stage of renominating at the end of 5 years as yet. But in terms of the buildings where this would really work, it's those buildings which are still in use, where the fact that they are essentially the big challenge is finding a place where the argument as to what the current community value is a slam dunk, which is to say a pub or equivalent, and where actually it's not going to be, there's so much space, land or building space, where it would be relatively easy to turn it into something else, and where the community could be brought along with that process. Because actually what the asset of community value drives off the shit developer, who is your biggest rival when it comes to buying, putting a bid in for that particular building, who bids up the price. Whereas if you can drive away lots of the competition, it leaves you with a freer hand to come up with your own bid, which is more likely to be accepted because you're not going to be involved in a bidding war.
This is probably not related to this question, but why would any pub owner want to sell it for £200,000? For £200,000 that they
there are different pub companies, and it depends what time of the year. There is a glut of them sold just before the end of the year, because it's a way of realising easy cash. Because the people who own the pub companies who own about 40% of the pubs in the UK have literally thousands of properties on their books. So if they can sell 10 of them, they make £2 million. And they've got some bonuses to pay to their staff. They've got some shareholders who need to be repaid. So they will sometimes flip them very quickly to the to a public sale, just because they need to get access to the cash. So the fact that they could get, if they were sensible, they could get planning permission on them, and they'd be worth a lot more. But these are people whose head offices are in London. They've got no real roots in the community. They've got no desire to be involved in it. They'd prefer to just sell them for as much as they could get. And some pub owning groups are better at bidding up the price. They use certain agents who are very good at sucking in the gullible to pay more. The big trick they like to do is an auction, because in auctions people do crazy things, like pay £500,000 for pubs without planning permission. Not sure, because they think they can easily turn them into residences. Obviously this is very much in the south of England. In the north of England it's a completely different story.
Okay. And if it's a community just buying a pub for £200,000, first of all, I mean, would that give them a better chance of getting a planning permission? So keeping it like a community something, and some residential.
I think if there's groups I've worked with where it's been relatively easy to persuade people to raise the finance, because what essentially happens is the owners say, this is an ex-pub. Used to be good, now it's shit because the community's changed or people's habits have changed. People drink at home, the VAT price is killing us. And they'll say all sorts of reasons, and they'll say, this pub has failed. It's on its 5th landlord in 6 years and it's just a bit shit. So we've tried. And the community will go, no, you have run it into the ground. We think this could be run as a very decent pub. But the backstop to those people is, but if it turns out that they were right, if actually it's really tough to run a pub here, who's going to be better placed to get planning permission to turn it into residencies but the community themselves who live in the area, who are able to make, this isn't avarice, this is a sensible usage for this property. It's a different approach to the local authority, and it plays differently. So yes, they would be better able to get the planning permission, which, if it was, Mr. AN developer, they might have more of a challenge because people's backs will be up. Why should this fucker come in and make £250,000 capital gain out of our community's pub? Whereas if our community believe that sadly our community cannot support its own pub, then we should be the people who develop it into something better and something different, and we can harvest the capital gain and use that for broader community benefit. That's a very compelling argument to a council planning department.
We had this decision around the Dyke Tavern, that we knew that process was going on, and one of the reasons we said we wouldn't get involved is because we don't want to turn pubs into housing assets unless the local community's exhausted all its efforts. I suppose the key question is, and sometimes we are the problem for local communities trying to keep pubs and facilities alive if we're trying to develop affordable housing.
I think
so it isn't an automatic tie between groups like we're working with wanting to develop their housing solutions and local people who want to keep pubs and community spaces. It really is that difficult thing of how do you marry up the moment when the community comes to that realisation and actually helping them to then move into kind of doing some decent housing rather than just private market flats.
But I think you do have an opportunity, because if you take the village in Hanover, which was, it used to be called the doom and gloom, it was. And it's much better as the village, I think, but it's got residences above, and the developer basically went, oh, fuck it, go on then, I'll take one flat and I'll let you develop the ground floor into some cafe kind of thing for the community's use. And so it's the act of getting an ACV did force the developer to change their plans and keep something for community usage. But there was, if you could have people, most community groups who are looking to take on pubs or similar assets have the problem of what to do with the upstairs, or the several upstairs if there's more than one flat. And because they're not necessarily sure they want to let it out to the person who runs the pub, it starts to become a bit of a bone of contention. Should we rent it out, or should we rent it out socially? Should we rent it out to our own staff to make it so that we can pay people less and therefore make the pub more profitable? And if there was a way to very quickly link up a group of people thinking this pub needs to be saved, but also these people want to do some co-housing or community-led housing, putting them together at an earlier stage would be an interesting thing.
So it sounds that really, because you were saying that 21 people on the back of a fag packet and pub could basically constitutionalise, or what you call it, but so really you want a clearer group, and that there doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict if it's initially there's a housing and a pub. And then if that, it sounds like it, because like the Cowley Club, I mean, there's lots of places, isn't there, where they've got housing involved. It's standard with pubs, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often, so.
And I think there was, I don't know if you agree, but I first got to know Dot when she was working with the group at the Cuthbert, and one of the challenges there was that the group of people who registered it as an ACV.
This is the Cuthbert pub in
Hanover, on the edge of
Freshfield Road.
Yeah, Baker's Bottom. And they were kind of like, oh, we're not sure it is got a future as a pub, but it's in our community, and we're sick of having the choices as to what our community looks like being driven by the market, which in a place like that would say, I know, let's put some housing there. So one by one they were losing the facilities which any community needs, and because the market doesn't give a shit that in 10 years time everyone's going to go, where's the fucking bakers, or where's the cafes, because it can't be bothered with it. So in that particular instance, though, the challenge was to motivate the community to care about what was an as yet unscripted future.
A space, it's more of a space.
Yeah.
And then that's what they felt they really needed, was a space.
Yeah.
To do different things.
Like a community space, basically.
Yeah, so it was like their offer was to turn it into a community cafe, so kind of like a hub for activity in that area, but it would keep that kind of cafe income to make it viable. And they have you seen recently, so they the owners have left a cafe space in there. They do want to develop the site, but they've left a cafe space in it, and same with the lectern.
Oh, have they?
Yeah, that they all are hoping to put out to community groups to run. So we'll see.
Can I ask some kind of left of field question? Just probably a remark, but I'll just ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Urban fringe sites.
Yeah.
Mini golf course.
Yeah.
It's got a kind of community asset there, a cafe.
Yeah.
But most of it is a mini golf course.
Yeah.
And a small section of that is earmarked for housing.
Yeah.
Is that possible to run?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a mini golf thing, essentially, when the council look for, does this provide community benefit, the evidence is whatever convinces them. It's not like that, but what has convinced them in the past has been Facebook posts of people going, I loved that pub, I had my 21st birthday in there, it was good, here is a picture of us all drunk. And that's kind of what it looks like. So the evidence level is not particularly high. So it wouldn't be too hard to get people to say, I had a good time at the golf centre, and critically getting them to say something along the lines of, I made friends with people who I would never have made friends with if we'd not met each other on the crazy golf course. It's because if you only have fun with people you know in your family, it's good for your family's benefit, but not necessarily for the community more broadly. So you need to create serendipitous mixing of people, and as long as you can demonstrate that happens, now because you've got a cafe, that can happen in a cafe much more easily. If you've got a cafe space which is used by a group of people who regularly come down to have a regular date with the crazy golf, and then they have a cup of tea afterwards and go home, tick, brilliant, that's your community benefit, and you just need pictures to prove it.
Okay, even though it's owned by council, that whole...
Yeah, if it's owned by the council, it creates the interesting position that the council might have a strategic earmarking for this to be shitloads of very lucrative housing, and some council officer has to decide, should I throw a spanner in their works? But yeah, there's no reason why a crazy golf site with a cafe shouldn't be a perfectly valid site for a community value nomination.
But if there's no framework and you can't appeal it,
yes,
then why would the council approve it if it's in their interest to keep it?
The only reason is if the only reason they could ultimately ever sort of refuse it is to use such tortuous and specious logic that everyone would point and laugh. Then and you made public hay out of this and said, I can't believe the shit they're pulling on this. That might not be a good look. And with the elections just round the corner, it's a good time. Yeah, nobody in the council wants bad looks for the next 6 months. So it's a good time to sort of force them to sort of, either do the right thing or do the really stupid thing.
So do you think this is a more adversarial approach?
I think it tends to be where there is an element of the bid owner, the land asset owner, just refusing, that they're fixated on a potential development gain, either financial or whatever else, over here, and they're just not engaging with you. And as far as they're concerned, the decision-making ship has left the harbour, and this is what it's going to be. So it's adversarial, but so I think it's something which you'd only use where, what have you got to lose? You've got, if you don't do this, it's going to be lost to the community forever. So you might as well, because the chances are, especially if it's the public authority who owns it, creating the situation which causes them to pause and maybe think again gives you the space to leverage the wider goodwill you'd be able to deploy as a community-led housing solution, but especially politically.
But it'd be like a public shaming approach, like we'd be saying, can't work with the council anymore, they're really resisting, we're going to sort of appeal to their sense of their public perception of them. That's
one way of doing it.
Okay.
The other way is, I use the metaphor of most terrorist groups used to have a political wing, and you could have, so you could be the reasonable people, but
right.
Some other people have done the lobbing of hand grenades into the council's policy. These are just 21 random people who happen to be in the pub one fateful night and have lodged the ACV, and they have nothing to do with us. Complete plausible deniability. You are kind of like, well, this just goes to show the strength of feeling there is for this particular asset.
That makes much more sense. The risk, I think the real risk of that in that instance is that, okay, even if you get it approved, you've got 6 months in which to then, what's the actual threshold to buy it?
The threshold is
to actually exchange contracts.
The 6 months there's no threshold to do anything. Once you've triggered the moratorium, then the landowner, in this case the council, cannot move it on to anybody else for 6
No,
months.
but if you're bidding then,
Yes.
the problem for our groups is that it often takes more than 6 months
Yeah.
to get finance together. I mean, on that site, planning permission could conceivably take a year
Yeah.
at best.
Yeah.
It would take a minimum of a year to get any kind of planning permission on that site because it's surrounded by millionaires row and
Yeah.
I mean, probably people who are specialist law barristers live there,
Yeah.
property barristers probably,
Yeah.
who would block it. The NIMBYism there would be massive.
Mhm.
So how would it work? So say you've got the ACV
Yeah.
and then the community group, say you've got a willing mortgage lender
Yeah.
and in order to get your mortgage you're going to have to get planning permission first because no one's going to lend a community group that money without a planning permission in place.
Yeah.
So planning permission takes a year. Does
Yeah.
that matter then? Does the ACV hold or does the ACV expire at 6 months and
The
you're still trying to get
ACV
planning?
will expire at 6 months.
So actually what happens is, frankly, the minimum the planning permission in Brighton Hove takes at the moment is 3 months.
Yeah.
So after 3 months, you've got your planning permission. At best, it's not going to happen on that site, but some of the sites it might happen in 3 months. You've only then got 3 months to get your mortgage through. So you've got to work at 6 months is actually quite high speed. For a controversial site like that, not counting else chance. It's of no use at all if you actually want to use that site. It's just use, like you say, as a bit of grenade. Thrown into the political fire, isn't it?
The only thing it can do is drive away everybody else. So the fact that
For a small period
you've
of
only
time.
got 6 months, but you've essentially made it politically untenable for the council to really look elsewhere, and they'll give you 12 months, where they'll go, oh right then, we don't need the grief.
Yeah.
But the sites where that sort of alignment of stars comes together to create those circumstances, it's going to be relatively few and far between.
What about a hospital building that's not being used?
One like at the top of Elm Grove or something like that.
Maybe.
Yeah, which was going to be a school.
Has it been used in recent?
And it's not presumed that would be that would, like you said at the beginning, that there are certain things that are that are immune, like emergency services.
Emergency services are the ones listed, but the NHS in Britain generally is not.
Oh, it's not?
Because it's been devolved into so many different contractors. Essentially, there is no such thing called the NHS in law anymore, which can be said anything.
But the same problem applies to that site as applies to the Crazy Golf Club, is that there's so much interest in that site, from Hyde to any other big developers. It's a big old opportunity.
The reason to do it will be all those people are basically having a conversation with themselves, and everyone else can basically piss off and wait to be told what the master plan is. Whereas if you put an ACV and lob your hand grenade in, they have to then start talking to you. They recognise that you are
just for fun.
Yeah.
I've no problem.
Yeah.
I'll go to the allotment.
But seriously, dealing with an NHS trust is like another. It's not like dealing with a private buyer, a single seller of an entity or a commercial corporation.
Absolutely.
The NHS, 6 months is like a drop in the ocean.
Yes.
In the process of those, so just stopping the conversation for 6 months, water off ducks back to the NHS.
Yeah.
I mean, it will take probably 2 or 3 years for those conversations to finish.
Because the ACV lasts for 5 years. It starts to affect their time horizon. So at some point in the next 5 years, we're going to have to deal with
That's what I was
this.
going to say. So it seems like a dull question, but what you put in an ACV on something that's not come up, not up for sale at this stage, because you're kind of preempting something's going to happen. And the developer just goes, oh, fine, I'll just leave it there for the next 5 years.
Yes.
And then the ACV expires and they sell it.
No, you relist it.
You can relist
You can relist it.
But at that point, they know, so you're then catching up again.
The question comes, is the developer big enough to close it to prevent community use and have it lying fallow for 5 years?
Yeah.
Some developers will happily wear that.
Yes.
Others have got much tighter problems and they just can't.
Yeah.
And so that's the calculation you get into.
Yeah.
How much can they afford to wear the loss?
Because I can't help but, when listening to you go through all of these, the only ones that seem to have any teeth are the right to plan and the right to bid.
Yeah.
All the others seem to be hugely stacked in the favour of local authority and the landowners and so forth. And even in the instance of bidding and that is still stacked in their favour of the local authority and the landowner, because they can just go, no, I'm not interested, I don't accept your bid.
Yes.
So it begs the question, really, why would you go through all of that pain and effort for something that is highly unlikely to actually achieve anything?
Yeah.
It especially when you're talking about dealing with land that is, you know, very much sought after, assets that are, you know, of huge value.
Yeah.
You know, is this the only mechanisms that are available, or are there others?
I mean, my take to that would be, ultimately, in a market-led society, if you can come up with the money, then you can do a deal. That's what eventually does it. So these rights can only really work in addition, alongside those. And as I said, it's the circumstances where you have a bidder who will ultimately recognise that you were right and that they were a bit wrong, and not be annoyed that you have thrown a spanner in the works, while still coming to do a deal with you. I think it's quite rare. I mean, just by contrast, if we're in Scotland, you know, think what you could have won. In Scotland, there is a legal right to buy. You can designate a piece of land or a building and say, we wish to buy that, and if the owner wants to sell it, an independent valuation is made, and if the community can make the price, it is their asset. If you happen to do it in the north of Scotland, you can force them to sell it to you whenever you choose. And that's survived the European Court of Human Rights challenge, and it's completely legal. But we got a very sad, limp, pale imitation of those rights. I tend to take the view that while Scotland did jump straight to having those brilliant rights, in England it might take using these and running up against how bad they are, to then get a future government to go, you know what, let's just do the Scottish thing and give everyone a right to buy, because one of the bigger arguments against extending the rights is that if people go, these are useless, let's never use them. So when the argument comes to extend their teeth, eventually governments will go, well, nobody wants these rights to have teeth because nobody's used them to find out they're just gummy sort of.
But it strikes me that that's a huge amount of investment.
Yes.
For something that may not actually happen.
Absolutely.
Forgive me if I'm being pessimistic.
No, and because you've got so much other stuff to invest time in, because the process to actually achieve what you're trying to achieve is literally sucking the very life force out of people. How much spare capacity do you have? I mean, I think it's one of those ones where if you're going to do it, then do it in a kind of, you know, one night in the pub, 21 of you sign a fag packet and send it into the council and think nothing more of it.
Because like the Elm Grove Hospital, so is there proof needed of the 21 people, of their local,
their names and addresses? The big challenge is that you will get people.
On the website of the council website?
No, you should be able to ring the council up and give them names, and they will tell you whether they're on the register. The big issue is that lots of people think they're registered to vote but aren't actually registered to vote, and therefore the council, so one, always get more than 21, and two, ask people, you know, if you really want to check it. The other way is to just have an organisation which can strategically do the nominating for you.
And does local, is there a radius, or is it like, because like that hospital serves a large radius?
No, because it's in Brighton and Hove, the 21 people have to be in registered to vote in a neighbouring authority to Brighton and Hove, or Brighton and Hove itself. So it pretty much takes you, 25 miles around.
No problem.
So given the context of what we've been talking about, it strikes me that there is purpose to all of these. However challenging it might be to actually implement. Therefore, if there are multiple groups and individuals all around the city getting to grips with the same stuff at all at the same time, it does beg the question, why doesn't one central organisation start to take responsibility for it on behalf of these groups? One that can then have expertise and so forth. That would strike me as being much more efficient and enable these things to actually go through with perhaps more dialogue as well and collaboration.
Absolutely. I think if this body, which call it the CLT of Hove and Brighton, or some such, to pluck a name out of thin air, it could also do a kind of, what's a decent idea because all great ideas start in the pub, but you know they are also maddeningly close to insanity. The fine line between genius and madness is usually one more pint. And so to sort of work out what makes a sensible strategic sort of bet for the CLT to use this power, which is going to probably annoy somebody. Is it worth it to fulfil our bigger agenda? And that can separate out the kind of the random, not going anywhere, not really much point to it, and it just needs to decide, as an organisation, I think it could make a sort of solemn pledge that we're doing this not to win friends, but for a bigger reason. We're trying to involve the community as much as possible in discussions and decisions about what happens with the fabric of land and assets in their communities.
Well, the very nature of democracy is, you know, to be able to argue a point that's opposite to the people over the table from you. So, in many respects, this isn't just being gits for the sake of it. This is really about standing up for something that's a different point of view. So, in many respects, I think the council would actually take a good view of that.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, they are a democratic body.
Yes.
And they would have to do so.
Yeah. I think, you know, the people would. It would be a question of how frequently you did it, because I suspect that there isn't somebody at the council who has this as their job. It's part of their job, and their job is probably to do some planning applications. And so it's...
I think the problem is it doesn't have teeth. So it's like you're taking an adversarial approach with something that doesn't have any teeth. So it's like
with the
it's
long
a
view
risk
of knowing that you need to do it to ensure that sometime in the future it could be given teeth.
Yeah.
So
but for people that are looking for housing now, it's really the long game.
It is.
I agree completely. I think for our purposes, most of us here, maybe for ourselves anyway, it's not going to work for us. But it's a very interesting thing that's going on, and very worth, like you just said, it's about moulding the whole development of our neighbourhoods. You know, so.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think the reason, because Dave and I worked before on kind of community rights, but specifically on these pubs, and we felt like personally, I think to create a community, you need spaces and spaces for people to mix and come together, as well as houses. So it's relevant in that sense, and I feel like the more people know about this stuff, the more people might see a situation and go, we could just use an ACV on that, or we could just have a go at using this because I feel like this is the right situation. Do you see what I mean? And the more people that do that, and that even if it's not this is definitely going to work, this is our only chance to get this building, because that often doesn't work, it doesn't come through. But the kind of using it as part of a toolkit of approaches, I think does work and can work.
Sorry, I want to ask the last question.
Please go.
We talk about the pubs or other public facilities to continent transport. What about some buildings not in the usage in Brighton? So we can do anything for them. For example, I know one of them. It's not usage, just windows and doors nailed. No in usage, so we can do anything for that one?
If it would depend on what the last usage was and when it was. So if it was a building which was formerly a house, it's
just formal house.
Yeah, if it's unlikely that you could do anything about that, because its previous use was residential, and that's not a community benefit, or a benefit to the wider community and its well-being, and because it's not in operation at the moment, it's just closed, it would probably fail on the test of being in the recent past and on not providing community benefit. It looks like an ex sort of retail corner shop. Got that sort of angular ending, but it probably ceased to be a corner shop many years ago when the car opened at the other end of the street.
So, but there might be there was other avenues maybe, but just not this.
Yeah.
There is other potential avenues, but not this.
Yeah. The community right to bid probably wouldn't help if it turned out that the building was owned by the council. You could maybe do something there. There is a council list of assets, which is on their website, which loads up an enormous PDF, which breaks most computers when you try and zoom in on it. But it is an asset register of everything the council owns, and you can see whether it's on that. I mean, going to that wider point about what could this be for? It's not a particularly thankful task, but I'm sure people do go through that asset register and just see what's on there.
What we advise people to do is come to Nicola, who's our land and property neighbour, because she's filtered out the ones that are hopeless.
Yeah.
Some of them are just not for sale, they're owned by private. Well, there's the council asset register, and there's the Brownfield site, and there's the Urban Fringe site, and they all have different bits of land bunged on them. Some of them are not available, the owner's not interested in selling them, they'll never be useful to us. And she's filtered all those out and produced a kind of home down list. So,
do you receive that list?
Not yet.
So
No.
yeah, if you're a member of the CLT, then you can ask for that list that Nicola's kind of honed down.
Is that list available?
Yeah, there is a list available. Yeah, yeah. She's looked at some of them and kind of put a strike through a lot of them, where they're basically not viable. Or she's got these if you look on our website, there's a talk she gives about how you decide whether land or properties are worth looking at. And I can't remember the three things she says. First, is it developable, i.e. is it up, can you get it or something? Or maybe it's first, is it viable, is it developable, in other words, what are the rules around it? And then is it viable, can you make the money work? And frankly, we can filter out a lot of the land that's in those big lists you can see by saying they're just not available in the first instance, or they're allocated for something else, or one is a playing field in Patcham, and actually to get a school playing field redesignated as not a school playing field anymore, it requires a whole process that the Secretary of State has to be involved with. So you can imagine if you're in a hurry, that's not an option, but if you're willing to wait 5, maybe 6 years for the land, then that might be an option. So all that sort of stuff she's worked through.
Or is it a tool to allow it to buy you some time?
Yeah.
So you stop it, you've got 6 months to try and build a case and
show you're paying attention.
Yeah, and even raise the funds or whatever it is.
Yeah.
To give you a chance, even though it's just 6 months, but it's better than nothing, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the reason why it's good. It's better than nothing. But it could be a lot better if there's something much better. Cool. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.